I'm Amanda Isaac, Associate Curator at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and I'm excited to be with you today to take you for a closer look at Martha Washington's jewelry inside her jewelry box, as it were. This is really the first time we have an opportunity to present a comprehensive look at her adornments. We're fortunate that a number of pieces do survive, thanks to the careful attention of her descendants. And what's even more valuable for us as historians is that a few survive in their original settings. We can say that so much jewelry from the 18th century was lost or was remade, that it's really a rarity to have pieces like this. Typically, each generation would have refashioned it or even have sold or given it away when it no longer became fashionable. Now, antique and historic jewelry, the use of rare gems and precious metals, is fascinating, it's enchanting, it's enthralling, it's breathtaking, it's wonderful to behold. As we consider the beauty, the craftsmanship, the rarity that went into each of these pieces. And it also invites us, as it did in times past, to meditate on the vanities of life. The understanding that while minerals and ore can endure hundreds of thousands of years, human life is brief. And the enjoyment of earthly possessions, such as these, is all too fleeting. Then as now, jewelry sits at this intersection of time and transcendence, the earthly and the heavenly, the tangible and the abstract. And for Mrs. Washington and her contemporaries, the question of what to wear was also a question about core beliefs and values and what mattered most, character or appearances. To begin with, then, let's take a look at this, the first portrait we have of Martha Dandridge at the time of her marriage as Mrs. Custis. She was a young woman of 26, and here we see her as she wished to be seen. In the portrait, only the color of her eyes and hair are really distinctive. Her clothing, the pose, were standard set pieces that the painter, John Wollaston, offered the client. And we see these time and again in multiple portraits by Wollaston. So her costume, her stance, the setting celebrated socially acceptable feminine virtues, this beauty and grace, without revealing any unique aspects of her life or personality. But what's particularly interesting for us today is to see what's not shown here. You'll notice that the only jewelry is the string of pearls in her hair. And we can say that that also is part of this set piece, this costume dress that Wollaston would have given, that would have painted. This is not an actual set of pearls Mrs. Washington owns. But as we look at it, the absence of any adornment is telling here. In electing to be shown in relatively plain dress, not to be shown with jewelry, there's no necklace or earrings or bracelets or anything like that, Martha was expressing her conformity to the expectations of her class. By the standards of the day, her appearance is indicative of her middling place in the social order, appropriate to one who's a member of the landowning gentry, but several steps below the nobility and the monarchy. Her lack of jewelry is also an expression of virtue, of virtuous moderation. And it's a choice that interestingly sets her and her Virginia Tidewater gentry apart from other colonial leaders, such as the South Carolina Low Country gentry, not to mention the English nobility and the so-called beau monde, the fashionable celebrities of the era. Just by way of contrast, take a look at these portraits. These are two young women of Charleston in South Carolina, and you see how they chose to be portrayed with an abundance of jewelry. These large strings of pearls on Mrs. Thomas, the pearls and what may be some diamond ornaments on Mrs. Beale, not to mention other luxuries, the ermine collar, the lace, and the silk dress with silver ornament that you see on Mrs. Beale on the right there. And then compare these portrayals with this engraving of Queen Charlotte. She's shown here just after her wedding to George III, and she's wearing just a part, emphasis on just part of her wedding jewelry. It's made of diamonds and pearls. She's completely covered here. And this would have been in addition to the diamond stomacher or frontispiece of her bodice that she also wore at her wedding. In her case, of course, she's not just presenting herself as an individual, but her body is symbolic of the state, and its adornment, draped in these jewels that were taken from Asia and South America, represented the magnificence, the prowess, the conquest of the empire. That, I think, really gives you a sense of how Mrs. Washington's appearance was set apart from the other people of her day. And what a potentially dramatic contrast her plainness, as her peers would have described it, would have made. Let's take a look, though, at some of the different types of jewelry owned by Mrs. Washington. Rings, we can say, would have been one of the most basic types of jewelry that she would have owned. And we know about these mainly from the documentary sources. Even at their simplest, rings were momentous in their meaning in this period. Men and women turned to these little circlets to mark great emotions, as we know today. So the major passages of life and death, of love and loss, joinings and separations. Rings as circles were ancient symbols of eternity, and there were these powerful, tangible tokens of hope that love ultimately would endure even beyond the grave. We don't know, unfortunately, what Mrs. Washington's wedding bands looked like, either from her first marriage to Daniel Parke Custis in 1750 or from her second marriage to Colonel Washington in 1759. They were likely handed down and refashioned over the years. We can say, though, that typically for colonial gentry in this period, wedding bands were some of the more simpler pieces of jewelry. So they may have been a simple circlet of gold, perhaps with a romantic inscription in them, but we don't know. Of the rings that do survive, many are actually mourning rings. Frequently, when a person died in this period, they left money in their will for friends, relatives, supporters to receive a ring in memory of them. Some of the first jewelry that Mrs. Washington ordered for herself from London were actually mourning rings. In 1757, just after the death of her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, and her daughter, a 4-year-old little Frances Parke Custis, she ordered rings for them. And the language of the order tells us a lot about what they would have looked like, but is also deeply poignant. She writes, she asked for, quote, a mourning ring for Mr. Custis, the best that can be got for 5 guineas with a stone in his hair under it. And then a mourning ring for my daughter, Frances Parke Custis, who was born the 12th day of April, 1753, and died the 1st of April, 1757, to cost 2 guineas with a stone and her hair under it. The language that she uses there suggests with the ring for her daughter, she meant the life and death, birth and death dates to be actually inscribed on the ring. And of course, she would have been sending locks of their hair to London to be made into these rings. Here on the screen, you see a couple of the rings that do survive, but we can surmise that the Washingtons, who lived relatively long lives, would have acquired many mourning rings over their years as they witnessed the passing of those they loved. As you can see in these examples, mourning rings at the time could be highly decorative. They weren't necessarily macabre or focused on the morbid aspects of death. And particularly for the ones you see in the lower half here, these could easily have passed as decorative rings. Purpose would have been known only to the wearer, and so a very private remembrance of the one they had lost. They frequently did incorporate hair, as you see in the one on the top. And I should say they're very delicate. So that top ring is only about 3/4 of an inch high, very small memento. The one on the lower right has a hidden bezel with hair behind it. So behind, on the inside of that rosette, is a lock of hair that has been mounted. So we don't know, unfortunately, who these were made for, but they would have been known to the Washingtons and memorialized by them, as they had this constant remembrance of these lives right there on their hand. Let's turn now to jewelry that would have been created purely for enjoyment and adornment. Looking at Mrs. Washington's orders for jewelry is so interesting. We get a sense of her taste and her habits, and we can say that she actually really preferred to spend her money on fine silks and lace more so than on jewelry. So for instance, she might spend 15 to 20 pounds on the silk and trimmings for a gown, and then 30 pounds on a set of handmade lace, but only 2 pounds on a set of a necklace and earrings. Jewelry truly was an accent for her, not the main show. She seems to have purchased a new set of jewelry every 2 years, to judge from the orders, and she built up an array of pieces. She acquired multiple French necklaces, so called because they were made of French paste, which was the faux imitation gems of the day, which were made of glass. This shoe buckle that you see, which is only about 2 inches long, is made of paste set in silver. And you also get a sense these paste would have had a foil backing to them, which gives some of them that gold color there. And you get a sense of just the high quality of the jewelry of this day. Colorless or white paste was the most popular, in imitation of diamonds, but you could also get paste in blue, green, red, and even black if you wanted it. On one occasion, we also know Mrs. Washington acquired a blue turkey stone or a turquoise necklace and earrings. By far, though, her preference seems to have been for garnets, and in this, she was totally in keeping with the fashion of her day. Here you see an incredibly rare survivor. This is Mrs. Washington's garnet necklace, still in its original setting. It's a design that was described as garnets set in roses. So it has these 5 medallions or roses, which are each comprised of 17 variously sized, brilliant, and oval cut garnets, and then 37 square cushion cut garnets in between, forming the links of the necklace. They are all set in silver, which would have been washed in gold to give it this warm, shimmering appearance. And this one, we can say, is believed to be the handsome garnet necklace she received in 1759. Again, it wasn't that expensive. It cost about 2 pounds and 10 shillings. Garnets at the time were the most in demand of the less expensive semi-precious stones from the nobility as well as the gentry. They were very popular, and they could even be worn in mourning if needed. We know that the gems were mined in Bohemia, and often they were set with rose red foil backing that accentuated their deep red color. What's interesting too, according to the fashion, this is a relatively small necklace, so it's meant to function more like a choker. And you see it here paired with one of Martha Washington's gown, which originally would have been this bright fuchsia and gold color. And you get a sense of just what a brilliant, dramatic appearance it would have made, just a little jewelry to bring up the colors in her garments. We also have a set of her garnet earrings. These, Mrs. Washington had her ears pierced in 1761 when she was 30 years old. And it's interesting to think about the fact that it took her that long before she decided that the pain of the piercing was worth the chance to be able to wear more elaborate earrings. These earrings were split up by later descendants and made into two sets. One you see with the rosette and ribbon, and then one was made of the pear-shaped drops. But originally, they would have all been one set, known as three-part drop or girandole or chandelier earrings at the time, which worked beautifully with the updos, the fashionable coiffures of the age, where you had these towering, your hair piled high on your head. As you can see with these, there is a wonderful variety in the shades of the stones. So there are some deep rose red, but also some lavender and pink stones. And on the pear-shaped drops, you also see the original gilt wash that's on the mounts that really would have brought up that red. Garnet pins for the hair were another accessory she acquired. These, again, are tiny, only about 1.5 inches across, but the pictures allow you to see in detail the mounts. And the one on the lower right there has lost, unfortunately, many of its garnets, but that would have been this beautiful floral spray, possibly may have had some ornament that has also been broken off there. Again, these would have been designed to fit in these wonderful towering hairstyles of the day. This beautiful ring is set all around with garnets that are graduated in size. And then we have another necklace. This one was remade in the 1820s, probably by granddaughter Martha Custis Peter, which we can see the style here with these gold chains in between is more typical of that period than the earlier period. But again, you see the beautiful variety, the use of floral forms, and quite an extraordinary piece. Now, you might be wondering, where was she acquiring all this? We've already mentioned how she sent to London for the Mourning Rings. And really, that was where the best quality jewelry could be had, is from retailers in London. We know some of their names from the orders. There was Susanna Passavant, who ran the Plume of Feathers, Benjamin Gurdon and Son, Vincent Mitchell, James Grimes. And from these retailers, they would have had access to some of the best jewelry available in London, but also being imported from the continent. But they were also buying in America at times as well. The major town they visited most often in the 60s and 70s was Williamsburg, Virginia. Washington was going there for business, attending the House of Burgesses, and patronized James Craig, the jeweler, at the sign of the Golden Ball. We know at least on one occasion, Washington went there to get some Christmas gifts. In December 1766, he purchased a pair of garnet earrings for £2 and then a necklace and earring set for £2, probably one for Martha and one for her daughter, Patsy. One of the most important forms of jewelry, though, in this period were miniature portraits. Portraits painted on ivory, set in gold, and then often worn as pendants and bracelets. Mrs. Washington commissioned these two miniatures of her children in 1772 from painter Charles Wilson Peale when he visited Mount Vernon. They capture her daughter Patsy at the age of 16 and her son Jackie at the age of 17. Notice Patsy is as a marriageable young woman at this point. How adorned she is in contrast to her mother and how she would have been portrayed at that age. Patsy has pearls in her hair. Then she has what looks to be possibly a paste ornament in her hair. There are pearls around her throat, a chain of garnet beads, and then some sort of decorative pendant down there at her breast. These would become very precious to Mrs. Washington. Within the next 8 years after these were painted, she would lose both children. Patsy succumbed to epilepsy in 1773. Jackie died of camp fever in 1781 after the Battle of Yorktown. But these at least allowed Mrs. Washington to keep her children close. You'll notice on the side, all these holes, these were designed to be set as bracelets to be worn around each wrist. And you see how that was done in this beautiful portrait of Mrs. Stuart. Around each wrist, she's got portraits of her husband and then possibly her father there. In 1776, Mrs. Washington commissioned perhaps the dearest miniature of all, this portrait of her husband, General George Washington. Now, during the Revolution, the resulting separation, the endangerment of her husband, she was certainly looking for a way to keep his memory close. So she commissioned Charles Willson Peale to do this. Unfortunately, he was not doing it from the life sitting. He was doing it from another painting he had done. And I think it's perhaps the most long-faced, glum Washington image that we have. So we do wonder what Mrs. Washington thought about it, but it was at least a general likeness of the one she loved. And this is something that she could have worn around a necklace close to her heart or held in the palm of her hand to remember. Jewelry in this way, we could say, could be an arbiter of time. It allowed you to have this unmoving image of a loved one to hold, or a ring as a memory aid. But jewelry, of course, could also mark the passage of time in the form of watches. Mrs. Washington had several over the course of her lifetime, but 2 survive in the collection and show us what she would have used in her latter days. They also give us a sense of how she responded to changing fashions. This one is from 1785. We know Mrs. Washington decided to get a new watch. She ordered one from London, requesting that it be, quote, handsome and fashionable, with a fashionable chain or string, such as are worn present by ladies in genteel life, the hour and minute hands to be set with diamonds. This is the watch she received. It was probably the most expensive piece of jewelry she ever owned, costing about 50 pounds sterling. The clockworks were made by Richard Webster, one of the preeminent watchmakers in London, the case by Valentine Walker. And just as she requested, as you see, the hands are beautifully set with diamonds. There are 28 in all along the fleur-de-lis hour hand and the minute hand and the rosette in the center. Within a few years, though, she decided to give it up and give it to one of her granddaughters. We don't know exactly what prompted the change. Her granddaughter was coming of age and perhaps needed more fashionable accessories. We do wonder about the imagery, if that affected the decision. It's interesting here. You see the back of the case, and there's this somewhat questionable scene of a young man or boy catching a glimpse of a woman about to undress for her bath. But on the other hand, Mrs. Washington gave this to her teenage daughter, so it doesn't seem she objected too much. One reason might have been the change in fashion for ladies in genteel life. By the 1790s, fashion was moving towards plainness for everyone, less ornament on the surfaces, though still a continued use of rich materials. In 1793, Mrs. Washington gets this case that she uses with the diamond-handed watch. What's remarkable about this case, it's relatively plain, but it has an engraving of her coat of arms as a married woman. One of the only examples we have of her using this coat of arms that only she would have been entitled to show. This shows the arms of Washington impaling Dandridge of her birth family. Then in 1794, she goes a step farther and she purchases this watch, remarking in her order that it's only to be 26 pounds, so about half the cost of the previous watch, and that plainness shall be no objection. And indeed, it is very plain. There's nothing engraved on the back. There's just a little bright cut floral border around the rim of the case, and the hands are plain gold. This is the watch that she used for the remainder of her life to adorn her purpose, to keep time and to run the household. Pearls never go out of fashion. Mrs. Washington probably would have had a number of different sets over the course of her lifetime. And by the 1790s, seed pearls started to surge in popularity. These tiny pearls were imported from China and India at that time. They were strung on horsehair or silk or mounted on mother-of-pearl backings and made into earrings, bracelets, necklaces, hair ornaments. And so with the onset of these new styles, Mrs. Washington decides to invest in some seed pearl jewelry as well. This is an intricate festooned necklace, appears to survive in its original form, and something she might have worn as First Lady. It features 3 sizes of pearls that are all strung together on a network of silk cords and silk ribbons. You can see the largest pearls are in the center of each swag, formed by two lines of tiny seed pearls, and then there's a sort of moderate-sized pearls forming the intersections, little rosettes at the joining of each grouping. It's a beautiful piece. And then there's this delicate seed pearl pin pictured as a bird in flight. It's got a succession of larger pearls, graduated pearls in the center to form the body, and then seed pearls outlining the rest of the silhouette. It might have been one of the pearl pins and earrings that Mrs. Washington purchased in New York in 1789. So she probably would have had a set of these type of ornaments. It also is very tiny, again, only about an inch and a half high. But you can see with the enlarged picture here, the detail of the pearls, and then also the attachment points where they were tied on to the mother of pearl backing. We also have a lovely set of pearl and enamel rings from this period. These two here, interestingly, they're almost identical. They've got the blue enamel center, a little white enamel border, and then the ring of pearls around the outside with a rose gold wide band setting. But you'll notice the center, one is a diamond and one is a pearl. Over the course of her lifetime, Mrs. Washington would have carefully chosen what jewelry to wear and what not to wear based on the occasion, public or private. And in her defining role as First Lady, in her public appearances, she really set herself apart with her choices. We have a wonderful description of her reception in 1795 that perfectly captures the impact that she made with the contrast she set up in her appearance vis-a-vis some of the diplomats' wives. Mrs. Washington, quote, was dressed in a rich silk, but entirely without ornament, except the animation her amiable heart gives to her countenance. Next her were seated the wives of the foreign ambassadors, glittering from the floor to the summit of their headdress. One of the ladies wore 3 large ostrich feathers. Her brow was encircled by a sparkling fillet of diamonds. Her neck and arms were almost covered with jewels, and 2 watches were suspended from her girdle, all reflecting the light from 100 directions. Such superabundance of ornaments struck me as injudicious. We look too much at the gold and pearls to do justice to the lady, noted the observer, a young woman. It seems Mrs. Washington had perfectly understood her country people, the earnest desire for a virtuous simplicity, sincerity of appearance, and transparent character over excessive display of wealth and magnificence. Her appearance was calculated, but it also seems to have reflected her deep-seated values, which remarkably were consistent throughout her life. George Washington expressed what seems to have been their reigning philosophy, saying, quote, her wishes coincide with my own as to simplicity of dress, and everything which can tend to support the propriety of character without partaking of the follies of luxury and ostentation. Thank you very much for joining me on this virtual tour of Mrs. Washington's dressing case or jewelry box. And I hope you'll visit Mount Vernon. You can see the jewelry, particularly the Garnet suite here in the museum. And I also hope if you can't make it to Mount Vernon, check it out on our website, where you can continue to learn more about the people of the past through the objects that survive. Thank you very much.